Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Video Production and Editing. Welcome to lesson number 6. My name is William Eames, your course educator. I hope everybody is in fine form for this lesson. I do hope that you've also been enjoying the course now as well, that we're approaching the final few lessons in this module. We've got a very technical lesson lined up for you today. A very important lesson where we're going to be talking all about shutter speeds, aperture, ISO, and essentially how to control exposure within our footage. So shutter speeds, apertures, ISO, these may be new ideas to you, maybe new terms to you if you are doing video for the first time. If you were coming from a photography background, you'll certainly have some understanding of these three elements of capturing light already. However, they work slightly differently when it comes to capturing video. So it's quite a long lesson, it's quite a technical lesson, but it is also perhaps the key lesson on this course for getting your exposures absolutely perfect and being able to understand video from a technical perspective will of course unlock your creative abilities as well. So before we get into looking at our shutter speeds, something we're going to be speaking about many times throughout this lesson is our exposure triangle, which is made up of light, time, and sensitivity. These three elements come together to create our exposure. Okay, so exposure is simply the light that is captured, that is recorded onto our image sensor, whether it's a photography exposure or whether it's a video, a film, it's still captured and recorded onto our digital image sensors. Now, this is a very familiar concept, well known in video and in photography, and it relates to the three primary exposure controls and how they work with each other. In general, you will be using two of these settings, and the third setting will be dictated by the camera. It's a compromise. Using the exposure triangle, using exposures is all about compromise. In video, time and sensitivity are your key exposure controls. If you're coming from a photography background, you know, light, which is controlled by the aperture, is something that you have far more room to kind of play around with. But we have certain limitations when it comes to shutter speeds, when it comes to sensitivity, as we will see. So, first of all, let's get into shutter speeds, which is perhaps the most important control and the most important aspect of exposure when it comes to video. And there's a very particular reason for this. Now, shutter speeds, they measure the amount of time in our exposure. Shutter speed is one part of our exposure triangle, and it controls the amount of time that light is allowed to expose the camera's sensor. Now, in photography terms, this is actually quite straightforward because you press your exposure button, the light reaches the sensor for your set amount of time, and the exposure is finished. When it comes to video, as we know, our exposure is constantly, our shutter, I should say, is constantly exposing, but it's still dictated by time. There's still, even though it's very, very rapidly, the shutter still effectively opens and closes to allow light to reach the camera's sensor. And this has a secondary impact as well, not just on exposure, as we will see. But let's have a look at shutter speeds here first of all, and just define exactly what shutter speeds are. So the camera's shutter controls the duration or the amount of time that light is entering the camera and exposing the image sensor, or, you know, if you happen to be using film. The length of time that the shutter is open is known as the shutter speed. So the amount of time that the shutter is opening and closing is known as the shutter speed. When we need more light, or if we need more light, the shutter will be open for a longer duration. So the longer that the shutter is open, the more time that light is going to pass through and reach the image sensor. And then, of course, if we need less light, the shutter is going to be open for a shorter amount of time. It'll be much more rapid, which means that light does not reach the sensor for as long as if we were using a longer shutter speed. And shutter speeds are measured in seconds and fractions of a second. Now, when we are talking about video, we really only are dealing with fractions of a second when it comes to setting shutter speeds. If you're talking about photography, you can be using seconds for doing very long exposures, but video moves so fast and needs to move so fast that really we're only going to be typically dealing with fractions of a second. Now, so these are what I would call our common shutter speeds. Okay, so going by the left-hand side, these are our slower shutter speeds. On the right-hand side, we have our faster shutter speeds. And as you can see here very, very clearly, with our faster shutter speeds, we're talking about incredibly fast, like 1/1000 of a second, 4,000 of a second, 2,000 of a second. These are much, much faster than we can even blink. So very, very, very rapid. On the other end of the scale, we're talking about slower shutter speeds like, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second. These slower shutter speeds will allow more light to reach the image sensor. They also have a secondary effect, which creates more blur and more motion within our footage. Now, you can identify shutter speeds on your own smartphones and your cameras, very, very clearly displayed in the camera's LCD, depending on the mode that you are using. If you happen to be using auto modes on your cameras, it may not show you the exact shutter speed setting, but in general, if you go into kind of semi-auto modes or the fully manual mode, you're going to be able to see your shutter speeds. As you can see here on the smartphone, in particular, it's an incredibly fast shutter speed that we're able to achieve here using a smartphone. There's a particular reason for that, which I'll speak about a little bit later on. But as you can see here, we also have a Nikon and a Canon display. It's important to identify exactly where shutter speeds are located on your cameras, because you are certainly going to be using them a lot going forward. Now, fractions of a second may also appear on the camera as this, so they may not have the 1 slash in front of them. They might appear as a whole number like this, 2, 4, 8, 15, up to 8,000. But just remember, the larger the number, the faster the shutter speed is, because remember, we're dealing with fractions of a second here. Now, as I mentioned before, typically we don't use seconds when we're talking about capturing video footage, but you will identify them with two kind of indentation marks beside them there, quotation marks, I should say, to let you know that you're dealing with seconds. So there needs to be some kind of indication on your camera that you're dealing with a much longer amount of time, rather than dealing with fractions of a second. So how your shutter works, or I should be more accurate and say how a focal plane shutter works. So a focal plane shutter is a standard shutter device. It's a mechanism that's a curtain. It's basically a curtain, a shutter curtain that covers your image sensor or your film plane. And when it's closed, it looks like this. No light reaches the image sensor or the film plane. As we can see, it blocks it out. When it's open, and we can see very, very clearly here, the light reaches the sensor for the amount of time that the shutter is open. This is known as a focal plane shutter. So a focal plane shutter is a shutter curtain that either moves up and down. In much older cameras, it moved from left to right. In motion cameras, much older motion cameras, it was actually circular and moved in a circle, because you were kind of cranking the shutter to allow light to pass through. But the idea is basically the same. There was a physical device in the way to stop light from reaching the camera's sensor or the camera's film. So how it would work, it would look something like this. So with slower shutter speeds, as we can see, the shutter curtain is moving. It's open for a much longer amount of time. But if you have a look at a fast shutter speed, you can actually see that only a very small part of the shutter curtain is actually open and is moving from top to bottom. It's moving from top to bottom, capturing the image or capturing the footage. Now, typically when we are filming, whether, whatever type of footage we happen to be capturing, we're going to be using a medium or fast shutter speeds. It's rare that we use slow shutter speeds. It's not completely uncommon, but certainly medium and fast shutter speeds are typically what we stick to. Now, as you can see, while it's moving down, the bottom part of the image, it just takes that slightly little bit longer to be exposed than the top part of the image. So for this reason, when we're filming anything using a focal plane shutter and we happen to be panning, you can get what's called a rolling shutter, which basically means that the top part is exposed ever so slightly faster than the bottom part of the image, which can sometimes create this type of slanted image. Now, this was a problem certainly in the earlier days of digital SLR film footage, capturing images or capturing video footage on DSLRs like the Canon 5D Mark II. However, it's not something that's so much of a problem anymore, and certainly is not an issue that you're going to come across with cameras that don't have a focal plane shutter. And on that subject, many cameras nowadays, particularly phones and mirrorless cameras, they don't have the focal plane shutter system. It does actually take up quite a lot of space. Removing it means that devices like phones, like mirrorless cameras, modern cine cameras and so on are much smaller. But then how do they record footage? So how does this work then if there's no focal plane shutter to stop the light from reaching the sensor? Well, how exactly does shutter speed work? Well, it's actually quite simple. The image sensor basically just becomes active very, very quickly for when it's capturing an image or footage. Okay, so it turns on and it turns off, it turns on and it turns off, and it turns on, and it continues on that whole way for as long as you happen to be recording. Of course, this happens extremely rapidly depending on the shutter speed that you use. So it's actually just electronic. The shutter becomes active to light, deactivates, becomes active, deactivates, and so on. And obviously it just does this, in fractions of a second. But that's how it works. And this is known as progressive recording. Okay? So with all of that in mind, well, what exactly, what shutter speed should you be using? Where do you start? Well, typically in photography, we measure the amount of shutter speed that we need to use based on, well, first of all, what type of motion we want to capture, whether it's going to be blurred motion or whether it's going to be a motion that's very sharp and still. However, when it comes to video footage, we are a little bit more limited because of our frame rates. So if you think all the way back to lesson number 2, we spoke about frame rates. Well, your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate. So to make sure that your footage appears to move naturally, your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate. Now, of course, you can adjust it based on, creative decisions, which we'll speak about now just in a moment. But as a starting point, you set your frame rate and then you decide the shutter speed that you are going to use. So let's have a look at some examples. I'll ask you a couple of questions and you can answer these for me. So what shutter speed to use? I'll give you the first one and then I'd like you to answer the rest of them. So if I shoot at 24 frames per second, what shutter speed should I use? So if I'm shooting at 24 frames a second, I need to double that, which would be 48. But there's no 48 on my camera, so the closest shutter speed is going to be about a 50th of a second. A 50th of a second. Shooting at a standard 24 frames per second, I would be shooting at a 50th of a second. If I shoot at 30 frames per second, what shutter speed should I use? Okay, so let's give you a moment to answer. Remember, you can type into Morpheus there with your answers. So remember, we're simply doubling the number of frames per second that we're using. So a pretty straightforward one here would be using a 60th of a second. It's not a dramatic difference, only a tenth of a second there in terms of the difference between 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second. If I shoot at 48 frames per second, what shutter speed should I use? So what's 48 by 2? That's 96. Okay. Now again, there's no 96th fraction of a second on our cameras, so we'd be rounding it up to 100th of a second. 100th of a second. And finally, if I shoot at 60 frames per second, what shutter speed should I use? So again, you're going to be going to 120, but again, there's no 120th, so we have 125th. We round it up to the closest one that is available to us. Just remember, you double your frame rate when setting your shutter speeds. Now, straight away, you can imagine that there is some limitations to this. However, it is still possible to overcome these by using our other exposure controls. And we're not strictly limited to this. We can still set slower and faster shutter speeds based on the frame rates that we're using. They will have different effects. So for example, if we use fast shutter speeds, we get a particular type of look and quality to the footage. So fast shutter speeds are used for creating a staccato type of movement, which is particularly good for fast action and indeed some cases for sports as well. If you have a look here at this footage, particularly I want you to have a look at the foreground here. I'll just go back and replay that footage. But if you have a look at the foreground here in this area, you can see you get this kind of staccato type of movement here from the railroad tracks. Obviously, it falls off with the kind of parallax type of view happening in the background. But this kind of jittery movement is very, very good for fast-paced, intense action on the screen. Of course, then the opposite of that is using slow speeds. Now, slow speeds can be used very, very effectively to give a sense of dreaminess and otherworldly places. They leave a blur, a trail on the movement, which kind of gives also a hallucinogenic quality to the footage. So, you know, if you're ever watching a movie or anything like where there's kind of, say, drug use or anything like that, sometimes they'll use very slow shutter speeds. One that comes to mind recently with kind of really striking visuals was a Nicolas Cage movie, good Nicolas Cage movie called Mandy. Some of you might be familiar with that. And there's a very dreamlike quality to that entire film. And there's a lot of slow shutter speeds used in that. Now, it's not just about slow motion. It is also about the kind of trail and the blur that it leaves as well. So let's just break it down a little bit further. So here we have just some very, very basic footage. We're shooting at 25 frames per second, so our shutter speed's at 50th of a second. If I just press play here, you can see the snooker ball rolling across the screen here. Let's just have a look at a slower version of that. So again, still shooting at 25 frames per second because we're keeping our frame rate to the same, but we're changing our shutter speed here. So we've got a slower shutter speed now, and you can see there's a little bit more blur. Now don't worry if it's a little bit tricky to see. We'll slow it down and we'll actually have a quick look at the still images of it. And here we've got a fast one, 125th of a second. And again, you can see much more jittery movement with that. Now, if we were to look at these, we just take the snooker ball from each of these, from our average to our slow to our fast, and you can very, very clearly see the difference between the three screenshots there. So our average, we've kind of got a natural movement. Our slow one, it's very blurred. I mean, the ball is not nearly translucent. It's nearly see-through because it's so blurred. You kind of get this ghosting type of effect. And with our fast one, we get a jittery movement. You can also see now the cue ball is actually more defined, is sharper, and is nearly a perfect circle, a perfect sphere. So for now, that's our shutter speeds. So hopefully what you've taken from this section is that, well, first of all, the main thing is that you want to set your shutter speed to be double your frame rate, but you can still use it creatively by adding fast or slow movement depending on the type of footage or the message, the effect that you want to capture within your footage. But moving on from that, let's look at another exposure control, but also a creative control, which is our aperture. Okay, so aperture controls the amount of light within our exposures. Aperture is another key part of the exposure triangle. It controls the amount of light that can expose the camera's sensor. So it effectively controls the volume of light that reaches the camera's image sensor. So the apertures are expressed as f numbers or f stops. They're also expressed as t numbers and t stops as well. When you're dealing with cine lenses, we'll speak about that in a second. Each lens will have a certain range of standard aperture sizes, but not all lenses have the same range of apertures. So most apertures will generally go up to f22, but they don't start at the same widest aperture. Okay, so not all lenses have the same aperture ranges. Okay, some are going to have more expensive ones are going to have far more aperture ranges than your kind of better value ones. Your aperture range is displayed in front of your lens like this. It's usually 1 to 2.8 or 3.5 to 5.6, etc. Depending on the lens that you're using, it is going to vary. It'll always show the widest aperture value available to you. Okay, so like I said, typically the majority of lenses will go up. Most modern lenses will go up to f22. So they don't display that information. They'll always show you the widest aperture available to you. The lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture is, meaning more light reaches the camera sensor. Okay, so a lens that's say f2.8, that would be considered what we call a fast lens, because it lets in a lot of light. It's capable of letting in a lot of light. Okay, so the lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture is, meaning more light is capable of reaching the image sensor. So, as I mentioned there, the aperture is always displayed on the front of your lens. Lenses will display the widest aperture available to you, but not all lenses start with the same widest aperture. Lenses that have a very low or very wide aperture value are known as fast lenses because they can let in so much light. Some zoom lenses will often have what's called a variable aperture. So in other words, the aperture will automatically change as you zoom in. This is just simply due to the nature of their construction. It is possible, of course, to get fast zoom lenses, but that's when you're talking serious money. You're talking at least $1,500 upwards for a fast zoom lens. So to kind of keep things affordable, they will typically stop down themselves automatically. So, for example, if I'm shooting at 18 millimeters, the widest focal length, the widest aperture value available to me is f3.5. But if I were to zoom in on my shot and go to 55 millimeters, in this case, the aperture will automatically get smaller, and the widest aperture available to me is going to be f5.6. Very important that you get familiar with that idea. Very important that you understand your limitations when it comes to your lenses. Now, a question that I get asked very, very frequently is, what does the F stand for in f-stop? Well, the F stands for focal, as in the focal length of a lens. So an f-stop is calculated by the focal length of the lens divided by the iris or the aperture, or the iris opening of the aperture. So, for example, if I have a 50 millimeter lens, f2 aperture, I simply divide 2 into 50 millimeters. That means 25 millimeters is the actual size of the aperture opening at f2. Okay, so that's quite technical, but for those of you who are technically minded, you're probably wondering where that comes from. Now, when we're dealing with video, we also have to take into account T-stops. So if you're ever lucky enough to achieve, getting into cinema and getting into doing actual, blockbuster types of movies, you're going to be working with T-stops rather than F-stops. So a T-stop is the exact same as an F-stop in that it measures depth of field, but it also measures exposure as well, and these are unique to cine lenses. So in a standard photography lenses, if I'm using a lens that's say 50 millimeters with an aperture of f2.8, the actual light that's being transmitted does not match the depth of field. Now, that's quite complicated, but in other words, it might be telling me that the aperture is f2.8, the actual transmission might be something like 3.5. So even though I'm getting the depth of field, my exposure is not exactly matching the F number. Okay, now that's not too much of a problem when it comes to photography. However, when we're filming, we're using many different lenses. You're changing your focal length all the time for different shots. You're setting up lots of different shots. You might be using multiple cameras at the same time. So it's imperative that exposure is correct. So T-stop lenses have the exact same exposures across all lenses and f-stop values. Now, you absolutely pay for it, so there's no advantage really in the sense of using a cine lens for photography. If some of you are thinking that, T-stop lenses and cine lenses are extremely expensive, very much for that reason, because they are used at the very highest end of production when it comes to capturing footage and capturing movies. So, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars for cine lenses. Now, so let's have a look at our apertures. So just the same way that we were having a look at our shutter speeds, we do have a certain amount of aperture values available to us as well. Now, I should mention too that what we're looking at here are what I call the common aperture values. Now, you'll certainly see on your own lenses, you'll probably have more numbers available to you in between each of these f-stop values. But there's a particular reason, and similarly with our shutter speeds, that I'm only showing you these values, which will become clearer a little bit later on in the lesson. But as we can see very, very clearly, the lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture is, meaning that more light passes through. Now, more light has a creative effect as well. It means that we also have a shallow depth of field. So with less light, when we're using higher aperture values, so a very, very bright sunny day, we might decide that we need to use a high f-stop value, but that's also going to give us a deeper depth of field. That means that we're going to have everything very kind of sharp and in focus from the foreground to the background, compared to a shallow depth of field, which will usually give us a nice soft, out of focus background, depending on what we are filming. So these are your standard aperture sizes. So how an aperture works, well, basically, it's very, very straightforward. It works very, very similar to our eyes. When the aperture is wider, this allows more light to pass through it. So, when you go into a dark room, or, when it's nighttime, our pupils dilate, they get wider, they get bigger to allow more light to pass through. So we can see in the dark. This is exactly the same way our apertures work on our lenses. We use a wider aperture to allow more light to come through, and we use a smaller aperture, and this restricts the flow of light, meaning less light gets through. Okay, now as you can see there, just a short GIF on the changing aperture sizes going from very, very wide to very, very small. Okay, so we can control aperture in a number of different ways. Typically on our DSLRs, it's going to be one of the adjustment wheels that we can use for specifically controlling aperture. If you only have one if you only have one adjustment wheel available to you, you may need to press that plus and minus button that you can see there. It has a little aperture symbol beside it. You'll have to press that and hold it down to adjust your aperture. Or with older lenses, and indeed with cine lenses, you'll be adjusting the aperture directly via the lens itself. So as you can see here with our 50mm 1.8, we have all the different aperture numbers available to us, and we would be physically changing it by rotating the aperture ring on the lens itself. Again, very important to get familiar with how to adjust aperture on your own cameras. Now, just a very important note as well, if you happen to be using a smartphone and watching this course, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to change the aperture. You're only going to be able to change your shutter speed and ISO. However, it is still possible to achieve a shallow depth of field, which we'll have a look at now in just a moment. Before we have a look at depth of field, it's important to understand the plane of focus. So the plane of focus is all about the point that we focus on within our image. Okay, so it's basically the place in the image, whether it's a still image or whether it's our video, where we choose to focus in a photograph. Our depth of field extends from this point. So here in this still image, we can very, very clearly see the plane of focus because we're using a very shallow depth of field. And we can see these little shrubs, these little crops are very sharp in one very narrow line. Everything before it and everything behind it is out of focus. That's because of a shallow depth of field. This is our plane of focus, and this is where our depth of field extends from. Okay, so this area here, very, very clearly defined, is our plane of focus. So let's have a look at how we can use depth of field creatively. And shallow depth of field, very popular. And that's to do with a shallow depth of field. Now, using the plane of focus, in other words, the point we focus on, and setting a very wide aperture, depth of field extends from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. And depth of field can be used to guide the viewer's attention and isolate the subject. So say, for example, you're trying to show how somebody in a drama is feeling quite isolated, with everything that's going on around them. You would typically use something like a shallow depth of field, or perhaps you are doing something about wildlife and you're filming, the very small, minute nature. Again, shallow depth of field helps us just focus on perspective and guides our attention to exactly what it is that you're trying to show the viewer. Now, a deep depth of field, of course, is the opposite, which this is something that tries to have sharpness throughout the entire photo or video. From everything in the foreground to the background, everything appears sharp. This is often used in landscapes, establishing shots, and generally just to try and help keep focus within the scene. So using a deeper depth of field, we'll just try to maintain focus, within a scene. Now, that does not necessarily mean going all the way up to an aperture of f/22. In fact, apertures of f8, f11 and f16 generally tend to be a little bit sharper. But you're typically going to use these a little bit more than you are going to be using a shallow depth of field. So we can adjust depth of field basically using our plane of focus and using our aperture. So let's have a look at an example here where we've got a row of people. We've got our cinecam in this case. We're focusing on the gentleman here in the very front row. Okay, and we're using an aperture of f2.8. So using an aperture of f2.8, like I said, the depth of field extends from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. So that also means that the lady standing behind him is also somewhat in focus as well. Okay, so we're keeping our focus on the subject in the front row, and we're only changing our depth of field. We're only changing our aperture setting here. So we change it to f4. So now what we're doing here is we're reducing the amount of light in the scene, but it also means that we have a deeper depth of field, which brings in 2 more people into focus. Just remember, we're only focusing on the person here in the front row. We're not changing our focus here at all. All we're doing is changing our aperture setting. So we change it to f5.6, we change it to f8, f11, f16, the entire way through to bring everybody else within focus. So adjusting depth of field will help to deepen the focus from the plane of focus, from the point that we choose to focus on. However, we can also use this in a different way, which is known as racking focus. So racking focus is all about, simply changing the focus while maintaining the same depth of field. It's changing the plane of focus while filming. So in this bit of footage here, the videographer was focusing on the lady in the front and simply switches and changes the focus to the gentleman behind. We'll just play that again to show that to you again. So we're maintaining the same aperture setting here, but we're only changing the focus. That is known as racking focus. So let's have a look at racking focus using our lineup of people here again. In this case, we're just going to stick to the same aperture. We're going to use f2.8 and we're going to simply change focus. So starting off by focusing on the gentleman in front again with our depth of field bubble, it gets that lady standing behind him in focus as well. If I were to maintain the same depth of field and rack my focus and focus on the lady here with the shirt wrapped around her waist, using the same aperture setting again, gets her in focus. We move our focus again to the gentleman in the suit and the guy with the record. And again, it's just keeping them in focus. So by changing my focus but maintaining my aperture, that means that I can actually get a depth of field effect in front and behind my subjects too. Now, aperture isn't the only thing that controls depth of field. Distance to your subject will also have an impact on the shallow or the deep depth of field effect. So this is going to be particularly important, say, if you are a mobile phone user and you don't have the option of changing aperture. It is still possible to achieve depth of field. So let's say, for example, we're filming with our motion camera. We're maintaining an aperture of f8. We've got our subject. In this instance, they're quite close to the camera. The depth of field, as I've mentioned, is going to extend from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject here, as we can see here highlighted in pink. Now, if our subject is that little bit further away from the camera, obviously our plane of focus, we're focusing our subject, that depth of field begins to get larger. The area that it covers that's in focus is greatly expanded. Now, again, we're focusing on our subject here, and again, it's still about 2/3 in front, or sorry, 1/3 in front of the subject and 2/3 behind the subject, but it covers a much greater area. And again, finally, using f8, our subject is placed very far away from the camera. The depth of field has a very exaggerated effect, and basically everything is going to look sharp. So even using higher aperture values, if your subject is quite close to the camera, you're still going to get a shallow depth of field effect. So you're absolutely not that limited when it comes to your aperture values. And certainly, as I mentioned, if you happen to be using a mobile phone, a smartphone, it is still possible to achieve a depth of field effect, but you are just going to simply have to get much closer to your subject. Now, of course, you can also use this in the opposite way, where if you're trying to maintain a very sharp depth of field, you can try to focus on something that is much further in the distance to try and keep everything nice and sharp, which is very, very important when it comes to doing kind of, landscape type shots, establishing shots. Now, this is a much more complicated area known as the hyperfocal point, something we do cover in detail later on in the course. Basically, if you are trying to maintain a very sharp image, a very sharp picture, sharp footage, you're going to want to try and set your plane of focus on something farther in the distance. Now, focusing when it comes to capturing video footage can be quite tricky because typically you're going to try and rely on your manual focus rather than using the autofocus, because autofocus is slow and autofocus can be noisy. Now, autofocus systems are getting better every single month, every single year. There's huge advances in the quality of them because so many people do video using DSLRs now and with these kind of standard lenses and not cine lenses. But still, the best way to focus is always going to be to do it manually. Now, to help with that, there are a couple of accessories you can buy, like your LCD screens here. As you can see, it attaches to your DSLR, plugs into the side ports of it here, and it'll give you a larger display that you can work from. Now, they're expensive, so a much cheaper way to go is to use simply an LCD hood or an LCD loop, like you can see here over on the right-hand side. There's quite a lot going on there in terms of that. As you can see, that's an electronic version, so you can actually plug in things like your headphones. You can still control the menu and your settings and so on as well using that particular one. But it is also possible to get ones that are simply there to kind of help magnify your LCD screen too. And these will all help with trying to achieve greater depth of field and focus. You can also, if you're lucky enough to have a camera, and certainly many phones have this option as well, you can use focus peaking. So focus peaking, as you can see here, with our Fujifilm and with our bottle of wine, it's basically, it'll show up on the display, whether it's through the viewfinder or whether it's through the LCD screen. It'll actually highlight the areas that are in focus. And this is really, really great for helping you to know exactly where you're focused on, particularly when you are using very shallow depth of field. So if we have a look at the image here on the right, using the bottle of wine, you can see here the areas highlighted in green that are in focus. Everything outside of that area is out of focus, is in shallow depth of field. So only the top of the bottle of wine here, with a part of that coil there, is in focus. Everything outside of that area, so very, very shallow depth of field that's being used here, that's all out of focus. So focus peaking, check to see if your camera has it as an option, as it'll greatly help you when it comes to focusing. Now, so for our final topic for this lesson, let's just quickly have a look at ISO and the role that it plays within the exposure triangle. So compared to our light and time, or shutter speed, and our apertures, ISO doesn't really play so much of a creative function compared to our shutter speed and apertures. It is much more of a technical function, which is all to do with how sensitive our camera's sensor is to light. In other words, we increase ISO when we're finding it difficult to capture the exposure in situations where not a lot of light is available to us. It's like turning up the sound on a stereo, pretty much. You know, if you can't hear it, you turn it up so that you can hear it a little bit more clearly. It's exactly the same way that our ISO works when it comes to our image sensors. Now, ISO usually appears on the camera display like this. Now we've got the 50 and the 12,000 and the 25,000 highlighted in red for a particular reason. But these are your typical ISO values. As you can see, it pretty much doubles every single time. Now, again, you may find more numbers on your cameras within these, between each of these values. But again, there's a particular reason that we're only looking at these values right now. Now, the ones that are highlighted in red, these would be considered expanded ISO ranges. Expanded ISO ranges. In other words, they're not always used on a daily basis. Everything that's highlighted in yellow would be our standard ISO ranges, and usually what we try to achieve when we're using ISO is the lowest value possible. Now, 50 is very low. This would be in a situation where we're perhaps shooting within a studio environment where we've got a lot of artificial lighting. But if we happen to be shooting using natural light, daylight, or natural light combined with artificial light, we're going to try and keep within our 100 to perhaps 800 ISO range. And as the light begins to fall off, we'll start increasing it gradually. But we aim to try and keep the lowest ISO possible available. And the reason for this is because of noise. As we increase ISO, noise is introduced into the image, into the footage, and this is basically because as we're increasing the ISO, we are, like similarly to, as I mentioned with our stereo, when we increase sound on our stereos or microphones, it will pick up more distortion. Okay, it'll pick up more distortion, and noise is the exact same idea here when it comes to ISO, except it's simply visual. When we increase sensitivity, we pick up more distortion, we pick up more noise, and it's visually represented in our footage. This is why we aim to try and keep noise, or try to keep our ISO as low as possible to reduce the amount of noise within the image. Now, just a quick note, noise and grain are not the same thing. So grain is something to do with film is an aesthetic choice as well as a technical choice. And grain is all to do with film emulsion. Noise is very much a digital artifact and is not necessarily aesthetically pleasing in the same way that grain is. So let's just have a quick look at an example here where we're gradually increasing our ISO ranges, our ISO settings. And as we can see that the noise is increasing, it's quite severe at ISO 3200. Now, modern cameras are very, very good at handling noise. So it is well worth testing the levels of noise on your own camera before you make a decision to what's your limit when it comes to the ISO range you want to use. So, you know, in the past when we were shooting on, you know, again, I'll just use a 5D Mark II as an example, Canon 5D Mark II as an example, because it was the first DSLR that had full HD footage. When I used to use that and I was shooting at 3200 ISO, there was a huge amount of noise. But if you were to compare that to the latest and greatest Sony, Canon and Nikon cameras, the level of noise is not the same at all. Camera sensors are becoming much better at handling noise. So don't be afraid to increase your ISO. You can test this out very, very simply. So here we've got lots of different ISO settings. The way to test this out, all you need to do is attach your camera's lens cap to your lens, switch the camera to manual focus, and simply take a photograph at different ISO values, because you're going to be photographing the back of the lens cap, which is just going to be dark. This way you can actually measure the amount of noise in the image. So as you can see here within this example, I'm not sure exactly what camera it's from, but we can go all the way up to about 2500 ISO, which is very high, without getting that much noise, getting to what I would call an acceptable level of noise, acceptable level of interference. Now, beyond that, we can see the noise begins to get quite severe. But again, it is actually still manageable in post-production as well. It is still possible to reduce noise. Using very high ISO ranges, this would be much more for, say, surveillance or security purposes where the quality of footage isn't so important because it's not going to be broadcasted, but it's still important to somebody who needs to capture security footage in very extreme situations. Now, so with all of this in mind, how do we know what settings that we're supposed to use? So we now have 3 exposure settings available to us, 2 of those that have a very creative purpose. So we've got our shutter speed, which controls motion, we have our aperture, which controls depth of field, and we have our ISO, which controls sensitivity. How do we know where to start and what settings to use? Well, first of all, you need to determine what mode you're going to shoot in. So if you are photographing or if you're videoing in semi-auto modes like shutter priority, where you'll simply choose the shutter speed you want to shoot at, which is very, very useful if you just want to concentrate on getting good footage, setting your frame rate, setting your shutter speed. The camera will handle everything else. There's aperture priority mode. There's program mode. These 3 modes will give you semi-control. In other words, when you make an adjustment, the camera will adjust everything else to make sure that you're maintaining the correct exposure. However, if you decide to shoot in fully manual, you're going to need to use the light meter to help guide you as to what the correct exposure is. So the light meter is found within our LCD screens and indeed is found within the viewfinders of our cameras as well. So if you haven't got an electronic viewfinder or an optical viewfinder, you'll generally find it on the camera's LCD screen. And as you can see here, it's located just below where the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO is. And similarly through the viewfinder, we've got our shutter speed, aperture and ISO settings. So
as you can see here, it's essentially a scale. It's either going to go from -2 to +2. It might be greater than that. It might be -3 to +3. It might be even greater than that. It might be -5 to +5. It completely depends on the type of camera that you're using. But the light meter is essentially a scale that we use to balance our exposure, and we aim to change our settings to get that exposure in the center. Okay, now obviously there's going to be quite a bit of compromise with this as well in terms of our own creative vision. But let's just have a look at an example. So first of all, when speaking about measuring light, we speak about light in terms of stops. A stop in photography or video refers to a measurement of light. A stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light in your scene. So anytime I decide I want to increase the amount of light in my scene by 1 stop, I'm doubling the amount of light within the scene. Anytime you double the amount of light getting to the camera sensor, you are increasing the light by 1 stop. Okay? Anytime you have the amount of light getting to the camera sensor, you are decreasing the light by 1 stop. So if I decide then my scene is a little bit overexposed and I say to myself, well, okay, I want to decrease the light by 1 stop, I'm decreasing the light by half. So with that in mind, when reading our light meter, it's going to give us a value of -2. That means it's 2 stops underexposed. I'd need to make a 2-stop adjustment to get the exposure correct. That means I need to add 4 times the amount of light to the scene to get it right. It doubles each time. Similarly here, if it's -1 stop, I know I need to increase the exposure by a stop. Here, the correct exposure is achieved when the light meter is set to 0. When it's in the middle, that means we've got the correct exposure. Here, we're overexposed by 1 stop, so we need to decrease the light by a stop. That means we're decreasing it by half. And here we are over by 2 stops. That means we need to adjust our exposure by 2 stops down. We need to reduce the amount of light getting into the scene to get the exposure back to 0. Okay, so shutter speeds, coming back to our shutter speeds, the reason that I was only showing you these particular values when it came to shutter speeds is because each shutter speed is 1 stop apart. Now there's other numbers in between each of these shutter speeds. These are smaller increments. These are thirds of stops, but these particular values, they're 1 stop apart. So in other words, when I change my shutter speed, say from 250th of a second to 500th of a second, I'm changing the value by 1 stop. In that particular case, I'm reducing the amount of light by 1 stop. Remember, the higher the number here, the less light that gets to the image sensor. Similarly here then, if we move on to our apertures, each aperture value is 1 stop apart. So f5.6 is twice the size of f8, meaning that twice the amount of light comes in, meaning they're 1 stop apart. Okay, so remember, with our apertures, the higher the f number, the higher the f value, the less light that reaches the image sensor. So as I go down in my f numbers, I'm increasing the light by 1 stop each time. And finally then, with our ISOs, the exact same thing here. Each ISO is 1 stop apart. Okay, so if I'm filming and I've got my aperture and my shutter speed set to a particular number of values that I want to maintain. So say for example, I've got my shutter speed to a 60th of a second. I've got my aperture set to f11. I don't want to adjust them because I want to maintain those settings. Then I could change my ISO and I could increase it or decrease it as is needed. Okay, so that's how it all works. We use these 3 metrics for measuring our exposure. We use the light meter as a starting point for how we adjust our exposure, and we adjust our exposure based on our creative needs and our exposure needs too. It's all about compromise. It's going to take a bit of practice to get this all right, but you have all the tools there to help you to achieve full technical control and full creative control as well. Now, so thankfully, I'm sure you're very thankful, that is the end of our lesson. a lot that we've covered in this lesson, so I strongly recommend that you go back over this in your recordings if you haven't watched the recording yet, and take your time with it, break down each section so that you understand it all clearly. Now, in terms of our skill progression, we certainly take a big jump in this lesson, particularly when it comes to the technical ability, because the three subjects that we had a look at here, shutter speed, aperture and ISO, very, very technical areas that also gives us a huge amount of ability to achieve our creative vision, and absolutely communication then as well. So you're going to be able to really clearly communicate when you know a part of your exposure is incorrect and so on. You're going to be able to say, well, I don't think there's enough light there. Maybe we need to increase our aperture, our shutter speeds, etc. So I do hope that you found some great value within this lesson. The next lesson, we're going to be moving away from the visual side of things, and we're going to have a look at sound and the importance of sound. We cannot underestimate how important it is to capture good quality sound within our video footage. It can make or break your footage altogether. There's no point in having the most amazing footage in the world if the sound quality does not match it as well. So we will have a look at that in our next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, I spoke about our membership. We've launched that now. You can get a great discount on it at the moment, depending on which option you go for, the 3-month, the 6-month, the 12-month. I'm sure you've got lots and lots of emails and communications about this already, so I'm not going to try to push this too hard. I'd merely just say that if you're enjoying this course and you felt that you've learned a lot already, that it's only going to get better, that you're only going to learn more and more as we continue on. And I mean, remember, we're still at a basic level with all of this too. So even though after this lesson, some of you may be finding it quite difficult in terms of the technical side of things, there's still a long way to go. Video is very, very deep from creative and from technical perspectives. And the fact that you work with so many people within it too, we're only really scratching the surface now at this stage. So if you want to complete the course, I recommend the 3-month option. If you want to check out some of the other courses, certainly photography would benefit you as well. Graphic design would also be a great one to do with this, or perhaps you're doing this because you're a marketer and you want to start filming your own kind of content, creating your own content. We also have a digital marketing and social media marketing courses as well to help up your game. But I mean, the amount of courses that we have, there's pretty much everything there to suit your needs, and you'd have access to all of them as part of the membership too. So we'll leave that there for now. Let's have a look at your challenge for this lesson. I'd like you to record a video in fully manual. It doesn't have to be a very long clip. It can be 10 seconds, it can be 30 seconds, it can be a minute long. I would like you to record in fully manual if possible. Now, I understand that not all cameras have that feature available where you can shoot in fully manual. So if that's the case, try to at least take control of one of the aspects of exposure that we spoke about within this lesson, whether it's your shutter speed, your aperture, whether it's your ISO, whichever one of those. If possible, it'd be great to try and use all three of them together to create your own exposure. Use the hashtag Shaw Video as per usual on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. Now, so that is indeed the end of a very, very long lesson. I'll see you all back here now very, very soon for lesson number 7, all about sound. So until then, I hope you all take very good care of yourselves. Bye for now.